Hey guys, tonight we're not just looking up at the sky, but sinking deep into the ancient history of the very air you breathe. The atmosphere above you, so quiet and invisible right now, is not a constant. It has been torn apart, rebuilt, poisoned, cleared, filled with fire, and washed clean more times than you can imagine. And if you had been here in the beginning, well, sorry to break it to you, you probably wouldn't have survived even a single breath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine how many of us are sharing the same story across different skies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself floating above a newborn Earth. Not the calm blue marble you know today, but a blistering sphere of molten rock glowing with heat. The young sun blazed hotter than now, and its solar wind was fierce. Asteroids and comets rained down relentlessly, each one releasing firestorms, carving oceans of lava, and throwing entire atmospheres back into space. The surface below was unstable, a churning sea of magma cracking and reforming. Around it hung gases, thin, fleeting, fragile, hydrogen and helium, the lightest elements, so quickly stripped away by the sun's temper. You drift closer, feeling the heat rising from the surface. The air, if we can call it that, is thin, alien, and utterly unbreathable. You would find no oxygen here, no comforting nitrogen blanket, nothing to soften the raw violence of space. Imagine instead a suffocating emptiness, an Earth naked and exposed, its skies ripped away again and again. This was a world fighting for an atmosphere, yet even in that chaos the seeds of what you breathe today were being sown. Volcanic plumes rose endlessly, belching carbon dioxide, water vapour, ammonia and methane into the void. Each eruption was a note in the first rough symphony of air, but the balance was fragile, too fragile. Solar winds and impacts kept sweeping much of it away. For millions of years the atmosphere was more of a flickering presence than a permanent shield. Still, something remarkable was happening. Water vapour hung thick, steam rising from boiling seas of lava. Each new outgassing brought more of it, and with every passing millennium Earth's skies were being layered, molecule by molecule. You can almost picture it as a veil being woven over a wounded planet, a veil that, if it endured, would someday cradle oceans, shield life, and eventually fill with the oxygen you now take for granted. But in this early chapter, Earth's atmosphere was anything but a home. It was poison, unstable, alien, and yet, in that chaos lay the very first whispers of transformation. Now imagine time rushing forward, millions of years passing in the blink of an eye. Earth's molten seas cooled enough for a crust to form, water vapour condensed, falling as endless rains, filling the first oceans. Thunder rolled across skies lit with volcanic fire, and lightning cracked over boiling seas. Those storms lasted not days, not years, but thousands upon thousands of years, an endless deluge that sculpted valleys and basins, wearing down raw stone into sand and clay. Above it all hung Earth's second atmosphere. This one, heavier, thicker, and far more enduring than the wisps of hydrogen and helium that had come before. It was a cloak woven from volcanic gases, carbon dioxide in crushing amounts, methane in toxic swirls, ammonia rising from vents, and water vapour thickening the sky. If you could have stood on that primeval shoreline, the air would have felt dense, heavy, suffocating. Each breath would burn your lungs. Each step would be taken under skies tinted in strange hues, perhaps a reddish or greenish pall, shaped by the scattering of gases unknown to modern life. But here is the paradox. What would kill you was precisely what allowed Earth to take its first steps toward habitability. Carbon dioxide trapped heat, preventing the newborn oceans from freezing under the young sun's weaker light. Methane acted as a greenhouse amplifier, raising temperatures high enough for liquid water to stay stable. In the strangest twist of all, poison became protection, and into this hostile brew something extraordinary began to stir. The oceans, still young and shallow, became laboratories of chemistry. Molecules collided, broke apart, and combined again in endless experiments powered by lightning, heat, and mineral-rich vents. These were the first whispers of life, simple, fragile, microscopic, but destined to change the very air itself. It's humbling to think that without this second atmosphere, thick with suffocating gases, Earth might have remained lifeless. The very conditions that would have choked you in an instant created the stage on which life could arise. Poisoned skies, yes, but also a cradle. And so, the story of Earth's air begins with contradiction. An atmosphere too deadly to breathe, yet too precious to lose. A veil of gases that turned fire into oceans, emptiness into storms, and silence into the first sparks of life. You stand now in the world billions of years ago, staring at a sky still toxic, oceans still strange. The air is heavy with carbon dioxide and methane, unbreathable, alien. Yet below the surface of those seas, something tiny, fragile and unseen begins to stir. Life, simple, microbial, single-celled, had already taken root in the warmth of hydrothermal vents and the shallow shores. But most of these earliest creatures did not use oxygen. In fact, to them, oxygen was not salvation, but poison. They thrived instead in chemical soups, feasting on iron, sulfur, and carbon. Their world was one of fermentation and chemical bargaining, with no need for what we now call air. And then, slowly, a new trick emerged. Some of these microorganisms developed a remarkable ability. They could harness the energy of sunlight. Through photosynthesis, they began to split water molecules, releasing a byproduct utterly useless to them, oxygen. Imagine the irony. What was waste to them would become the very breath of every creature yet to come. At first, oxygen drifted into the seas unnoticed. The oceans were filled with dissolved iron, which eagerly bonded with the new gas, precipitating out as rusty layers of minerals. These banded iron formations, still visible today in ancient rocks, are like pages of a diary chronicling the moment the world's chemistry shifted. Every stripe of red iron stone is a whisper from the deep past, a testimony to those microbes that turned sunlight into transformation. But oxygen did not stop. The microbes, cyanobacteria, the silent engineers, kept working day after day for millions of years. And eventually the oceans could no longer hide the oxygen away. It spilled into the air, changing the skies forever. This was the Great Oxygenation event, more than 2 billion years ago. For the first time, Earth's air held a whisper of what you now breathe with every moment. But that whisper was catastrophic. For the early anaerobic life forms, oxygen was deadly. What for you is life, for them was extinction. Whole lineages perished, erased by an atmosphere turning toxic in reverse. And yet, in the ashes of that upheaval, resilience stirred. New organisms evolved that could not only tolerate oxygen, but thrive with it. For them, oxygen was not poison, but power, unlocking energy far greater than the old ways of life. That energy would one day fuel motion, thought, even dreams. The sky was still not like today, too little oxygen yet for creatures like you. But the change had begun, a slow, invisible revolution, powered not by asteroids or volcanoes, but by microbes no larger than dust. They would never know the legacy they left, but you, breathing now, are part of it. As oxygen seeped into the sky, the planet itself trembled with change. Volcanoes still belched gases, meteors still occasionally fell, but this new element, the byproduct of humble microbes, was rewriting the very chemistry of Earth. The air, once thick with methane, began to shift. Oxygen reacted with those greenhouse gases, stripping them away, cooling the planet. Temperatures plummeted, ice crept down from the poles, spreading across continents. The Earth entered what some scientists call Snowball Earth, a time when frozen seas stretched nearly to the equator. Imagine standing on such a world, dazzling white, silent except for cracking ice, under a pale sky slowly filling with oxygen. It must have seemed to the tiny creatures of that time like the end, and for many it was, but not all. Life clung on at the edges, in hydrothermal vents, beneath thick ice, in briny pools where liquid water still lingered. The atmosphere's cruelty was also its gift. For those that survived, oxygen was an energy source beyond measure, a key that unlocked new pathways of life. The paradox is striking. Oxygen was both assassin and liberator. It destroyed entire kingdoms of anaerobic life, but for others it offered a chance to grow larger, to burn brighter. With oxygen, metabolism could leap ahead. Energy could be stored, muscles could one day contract, brains could one day fire with thought. All of that began here, in this slow, microbial revolution, and above, the skies began to change colour. Before oxygen, Earth's sky may have been hazy, even orange, rich with methane haze like Saturn's moon Titan. But as oxygen grew, so did ozone, a shield against harmful solar radiation. The air cleared. The heavens shifted toward the familiar blue you now know. It was not immediate, not simple, but the stage was being set. By the close of this chapter, Earth's atmosphere was no longer a suffocating shroud. It was still thin in oxygen by modern standards, but the door had opened. The poison had become the promise. Breathable air was not yet here, but it was on the way. And from this new sky, all the complexity of later life would be born. If the great oxidation event was the spark that lit the sky, then what followed was a long, uneven burn. Oxygen did not simply climb upward in a smooth line. It rose and fell, sometimes surging, sometimes retreating, like a tide that could not decide whether to stay or go. Scientists have traced these swings in oxygen levels through rocks that still carry whispers of ancient air. Bands of iron, once dissolved in the oceans, began to rust out and fall to the seafloor when oxygen touched them. These banded iron formations, layer upon layer of red and silver grey, are like pages in a stone diary, telling us that the atmosphere's chemistry was in constant flux. At times, oxygen nearly vanished again. Life had to cling tightly in those dips, surviving through resilience and luck. But in other moments, oxygen surged higher than ever before, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Each swing reshaped the climate. Ice advanced, ice retreated. Rain carried oxygen deep into soils, fueling microbes and changing the chemistry of rivers and oceans. Imagine breathing then if you could. One day the air might feel thinner than a mountain summit. The next it might feel strangely rich, sharper in your lungs. No animals yet roamed the land, but microbes, algae, and the earliest eukaryotes were already navigating these invisible waves, experimenting with new metabolisms, testing what oxygen could offer. This period has sometimes been called Earth's adolescence, turbulent, unpredictable, full of stumbles and leaps forward. Out of it came not stability, but opportunity. Oxygen did not settle down right away, but in its unpredictability it opened doors. Cells with nuclei emerged. Complex life was now on the horizon, still distant, but imaginable. The air was no longer poison, no longer only promise. It was becoming a stage, and on that stage, the actors of evolution were beginning to rehearse their lines. Those turbulent swings of oxygen did not just stir the seas, they began to push life into new forms. Picture a shallow coastline around 2 billion years ago. The water, once murky with iron, now shimmered blue-green as oxygen rose from algae mats and drifted into the waves. Tiny eukaryotes floated there, their cells more complex than any before, carrying nuclei and the ability to store and process genetic information in new ways. Why did oxygen matter so much? Because with it came energy. A single molecule of glucose could yield more than 10 times the energy when burned with oxygen, compared to the slow, clumsy chemistry of fermentation. That meant cells could afford to grow larger, build sturdier walls, and experiment with cooperation. Small colonies formed, loose alliances at first, then more integrated, more dependent on one another. These were the seeds of multicellularity. But oxygen was not always a gift. In excess, it was toxic. It attacked DNA, corroded proteins, damaged delicate membranes. Life had to invent defenses, antioxidants, enzymes, whole repair systems, just to survive in this reactive atmosphere. In a way, oxygen was both the spark of opportunity and the constant threat of destruction. The creatures that endured were those that mastered balance, using oxygen for power while shielding themselves from its danger. Geologists call one period in this era the Boring Billion, a stretch of time where the planet seemed to change very little on the surface. But beneath that quiet facade, life was busy building complexity. Oxygen's uneven presence nudged evolution forward, forcing adaptations that would later prove essential. Without these trials, there would be no multicellular animals, no plants, no humans. Imagine the Earth then, a planet breathing unevenly, sometimes gasping, sometimes exhaling fully. The sky still lacked the deep blue we know. Methane and other gases tinted it in shifting hues. Yet within that air, unstable though it was, the recipe for everything ahead was already being written. The atmosphere was becoming not just a blanket of gases, but the crucible in which complexity would forge its first fragile steps. By the time oxygen had established itself as a permanent feature of Earth's air and seas, life was poised on the brink of transformation. For nearly 3 billion years, evolution had been slow, cautious, experimental. Cells multiplied, diversified, but they remained small and largely solitary. Then, something extraordinary happened. The atmosphere, already laced with oxygen, began to stabilize in a way that tipped the scales. You find yourself drifting in imagination toward the dawn of the Cambrian, about 540 million years ago. The seas ripple under sunlight, and within them, something stirs. Tiny plankton bloom in numbers never seen before, feeding on the newfound richness of nutrients and oxygen dissolved in the water, and then life takes a leap. Organisms begin to grow shells, hard plates, and protective armor. Predators emerge with teeth and claws, eyes capable of spotting prey, and bodies that move with purpose. This is the Cambrian explosion, a sudden, dazzling burst of creativity, when life diversified into forms so strange and so varied that even today they astonish us. Why here? Why now? Scientists suspect that oxygen played the starring role. With more of it circulating in the oceans, animals could fuel larger bodies, faster movements, and more complex behaviors. Metabolism surged, nervous systems evolved. The arms race of survival began in earnest. Hunters and hunted, defenses and strategies, all woven into a web of interdependence. And here lies one of the great debates in science. Was oxygen the trigger, or merely the stage setter? Did its rise alone spark this explosion of forms, or did other forces, tectonic shifts, climate changes, genetic innovations, combine to ignite the blaze? Perhaps it was all of these at once, converging in a perfect storm of opportunity. Imagine being there, if such a thing were possible. The seafloor teems with trilobites scuttling like armoured beetles. Worm-like creatures burrow through soft sediment, churning the ground into fertile patches. Strange, frond-like animals sway in the current, while predators shaped like scissor-mouthed nightmares dart swiftly in pursuit. The oceans, once simple, are now crowded, noisy, alive with competition and invention. The air above those waters still lacks the balance we know today. Oxygen levels fluctuate, carbon dioxide still ebbs and flows with volcanic eruptions, and the ozone layer, though present, is thin. But already the atmosphere is doing something profound. It is feeding not just life, but the possibility of ecosystems. And with ecosystems comes complexity, resilience, and the groundwork for all the wonders that follow. As the Cambrian oceans filled with this newfound variety, the atmosphere continued its subtle partnership. Oxygen not only made larger bodies possible, it also allowed animals to sense, respond, and move in ways no microbe ever could. Think of it as fuel for complexity. Without enough oxygen, muscles tire, reactions slow, and brains cannot spark. With it, entire ecosystems can flourish. You might picture an ancient trilobite scuttling across the seabed. Its body is armoured, its compound eyes glint faintly, scanning for threats. This little creature survives only because its tissues can draw enough oxygen from the water to keep it moving. Now picture the predator Anomalocaris, with its grasping claws and circular mouth lined with teeth, gliding like a sleek machine through the current. Its speed, its agility, its very existence depended on oxygen saturating the ocean. Without that, such a predator could never have hunted, and the prey could never have evolved defenses. The balance between atmosphere and life had become a feedback loop. More oxygen fueled more diversity, and more diversity drove interactions that shaped entire ecosystems. Coral-like reefs appeared, built by early animals that sequestered carbon dioxide and influenced the chemistry of the water itself. Each breath, each movement, each death fed into the cycle. But even then, Earth's atmosphere was not steady. There were dips and surges, times when oxygen levels faltered, and with them, entire ecosystems suffered setbacks. Fossil evidence suggests waves of extinction punctuated the Cambrian and Ordovician periods, when oxygen fluctuations deprived seas of the stability they needed. Imagine whole lineages of delicate, soft-bodied creatures disappearing in a blink of geological time, their brief experiments lost forever. And yet, the survivors carried on. Some found refuge in shallow seas where photosynthesis still flourished. Others burrowed deep into sediment, waiting out the instability. Life, as always, adapted to the shifting moods of the sky and ocean above it. The story of Earth's air was no longer just about gases. It had become inseparable from the story of resilience, of creatures able to endure the atmosphere's whims. Here's the wonder. The same oxygen you breathe tonight was once part of that ancient rhythm. Some of its atoms cycled through trilobites, plankton, or reefs billions of years ago. The atmosphere is not static. It is a living archive, carrying whispers of all who have ever drawn breath. And so the stage was set. With oxygen as its quiet ally, life marched forward into new experiments, new catastrophes, and new triumphs. From armoured trilobites to soaring cephalopods, from tiny burrowers to reef builders, the Cambrian seas became a testing ground for everything the atmosphere made possible. After the great burst of innovation in the Cambrian, the Earth did not pause. The Ordovician period arrived like a steady swell, carrying life into new shapes, new scales, and new places. If the Cambrian was the dawn chorus, the Ordovician was the orchestra warming up, layering more voices into the atmosphere's song. Oxygen, though still far lower than what you breathe today, had crept upward, enough to support a richer tapestry of creatures. Seas spread wide across shallow continental shelves, warm and flooded, turning coastlines into havens of biodiversity. Picture vast underwater gardens of bryozoans and corals, their colonies rising like miniature cities across the seafloor. They were builders, architects of habitat, weaving carbon and calcium into reefs that transformed oceans into bustling neighbourhoods. Above these structures, trilobites crawled, nautiloid cephalopods floated with curling shells, and early jawless fish darted cautiously. With each generation, oxygen was no longer just a background gas. It was a boundary, defining who could thrive, who could move swiftly, and who would linger in the slower rhythms of low-energy living. And quietly, on the edges of these seas, a new experiment began. Green algae, those photosynthetic pioneers, pushed out of the water in tiny mats and films. For the first time, plants explored the land. They were humble at first, little more than carpets clinging to damp rocks or soils, but their presence mattered. They exhaled oxygen into the thin air above, a whisper that land too might one day breathe. This was a fragile beginning. Without roots or vascular systems, these plants dried quickly. Without protective layers, they were vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation, but resilience has always been Earth's quiet strength. Some adapted, thickening their tissues, others formed partnerships with fungi, exchanging nutrients in ways that allowed them to colonize new ground. In these alliances, the first steps toward terrestrial ecosystems were taken. Meanwhile, in the oceans, oxygen continued to act as both a gift and a threat. Too little, and life suffocated. Too much in certain pockets, and chemical reactions destabilized. The balance was delicate, and from time to time it faltered. Scientists studying Ordovician rocks have found evidence of sudden anoxic events, moments when oxygen disappeared from stretches of ocean, leaving dead zones where even hardy creatures could not endure, but life pushed forward. Graptolites, strange colonial organisms that floated through currents like ribbons, flourished during this time. Their abundance shows how quickly creatures could seize opportunity when oxygen allowed. They built intricate branching structures, drifting and filtering food from the water, their success recorded in black shales that still carry their fossils today. The atmosphere above, enriched but unstable, remained an active participant in this drama. It was not yet the air you would recognize, but the arc of change bent steadily toward the breathable balance to come. Every breath exhaled by algae, every reef built, every organism that lived and died shifted the ratios a little more. The stage was being prepared, not for stability, not yet, but for expansion. The Ordovician would end with catastrophe, a mass extinction driven in part by atmospheric shifts and global cooling. But before that fall, life reached new heights, both in diversity and in its first tentative embrace of the land. The Ordovician story, though rich with growth, turned suddenly. After millions of years of expansion, the planet reminded life that nothing is guaranteed. Around 445 million years ago, the atmosphere and climate shifted dramatically, triggering one of Earth's earliest great mass extinctions. It began with cooling. The continents, clustered mostly in the southern hemisphere, drifted toward the pole. Ice sheets spread across what is now Africa and South America. With glaciers locking water into ice, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. Shallow seas, the cradles of Ordovician biodiversity, vanished, draining ecosystems that had depended on them. Coral reefs crumbled. Graptolite colonies thinned. Trilobites and brachiopods faced shrinking refuges. Atmospheric shifts deepened the crisis. As ice expanded, carbon dioxide levels fell. The planet cooled further, spiraling into a feedback loop of glaciation and collapse. The once fertile oceans, rich with oxygenated layers, grew patchy. In deeper waters, oxygen dwindled, suffocating life that had flourished just a few million years earlier. The thin line between oxygen abundance and oxygen starvation snapped, and entire groups of organisms disappeared. Some scientists argue that volcanism played a role too, injecting pulses of gas into the air that disrupted climate and chemistry. Whatever the exact triggers, the outcome was stark. Nearly 85% of marine species were wiped out. It was one of the most devastating blows to early life, an event that reshaped the evolutionary landscape. Yet, true to Earth's pattern, extinction also carved space for resilience. Survivors, smaller brachiopods, tougher trilobites, more adaptable cephalopods, began again, carrying forward the atmospheric legacy of the Ordovician. When glaciers eventually receded, seas refilled, and ecosystems rebuilt, the atmosphere settled into a new balance. Oxygen remained a force of both creation and destruction, but the long-term trend still pointed upward, inching closer to levels that could sustain larger, more complex life. And though plants on land were still primitive, clinging to damp surfaces, they held a promise. Their slow exhalations of oxygen foreshadowed a world in which land itself would join the great atmospheric conversation. The Ordovician extinction was brutal, but it underscored a recurring theme. Earth's atmosphere is never passive. It is a living system, responsive, unstable, shaping and being shaped by life. The survivors of this crisis inherited not only the seas, but also the chance to write the next chapter in partnership with the air above them. When the Ordovician ice finally loosened its grip and seas returned, a new age began, the Silurian period. The air above the planet was no longer the thin, unstable veil of the early Earth, nor the chaotic balance of the Ordovician. Instead, it entered a calmer rhythm, one in which land at last began to speak more clearly into the atmospheric story. On rocky coastlines, small green pioneers had already crept outward, primitive plants like mosses and liverworts. In the Silurian, they gained their footing. For the first time in Earth's history, true vascular plants appeared. These plants, with tiny tubes that could carry water and nutrients, were no longer limited to damp edges. They began to stretch farther inland, their roots probing cracks in stone, their stems lifting toward the light. Though small by modern standards, barely knee-high at best, these plants transformed the relationship between land and sky. Their roots broke apart rock, creating soil where none had existed before. Their leaves drew in carbon dioxide and released oxygen, adding a subtle but steady contribution to the air. For the first time, green patches spread beyond shorelines, creating miniature landscapes that softened the barren continents. In the oceans, life flourished too. Coral reefs, which had suffered in the Ordovician crisis, rebuilt themselves with new vigour. Fish diversified, including the first jawed species, creatures that could bite, chase, and carve out new niches. Each of these developments was tied in some way to oxygen. The richer the atmosphere and oceans became, the more energy life could access, and the more complex behaviours it could evolve. But the Silurian was not only about plants and fish, it was about atmosphere finding new anchors on land. When plants began to spread, they created habitats for tiny arthropods, scorpions, millipedes, and early relatives of spiders that crept among the greenery. These creatures carried the bold experiment of life onto land, breathing air directly. For them, oxygen was both opportunity and boundary. The air was rich enough to sustain them, but still far from the levels that would one day support giants. This quiet revolution, plants exhaling oxygen, animals daring to walk on land, was one of the most profound steps in Earth's atmospheric story. It signalled that air was no longer only a marine influence, dissolved in oceans or exchanged at the surface. Now it was a land-based partner, shaped by roots and leaves, by crawling bodies and whispering winds. The Silurian skies were still far from the breathable balance we know today. Carbon dioxide was higher, oxygen lower, but the system was changing in ways that could not be undone. Once land began to green, the atmosphere would never again belong only to the seas. By the late Silurian, the quiet green fringes of plants were evolving into something more ambitious. The first true forests, though still small and scattered, were beginning to take shape. Simple trees with woody stems reached upward, branching out into the sky, their roots binding soil more tightly than ever. With each passing generation, they pulled more carbon dioxide from the air and released more oxygen in return. The balance of gases in the atmosphere began to tilt. Oxygen crept upward, still far below modern levels but enough to energize ecosystems in a way never before possible. For small arthropods exploring these new forests, oxygen meant freedom, the ability to move farther, grow larger, and experiment with forms of life that earlier ages could not sustain. One fascinating tidbit from this time: scientists have found evidence of millipedes nearly a metre long living in these ancient forests, a reminder of how even modest increases in oxygen could give rise to astonishing sizes. Imagine walking through a Silurian grove, ankle-high ferns brushing your legs, and encountering a giant millipede crawling past like a living train. Meanwhile, in the oceans, rising oxygen supported increasingly complex food webs. Fish with jaws hunted in coordinated bursts, their movements quick and decisive. Coral reefs grew richer and more elaborate, fueled by the chemistry of a world slowly tilting toward greater breathability. And yet, the Silurian atmosphere was still precarious. Volcanic activity continued to belch carbon dioxide. Shifts in sea level changed the balance of carbon buried in sediments versus released into the air. The planet had not yet stabilized into the self-regulating cycles we rely on today. Each advance was fragile, balanced on the edge of climate swings that could have erased the progress in an instant. But the long rhythm of Earth is persistence. Once plants had rooted themselves into stone and set their leaves into the wind, there was no turning back. Oxygen had a foothold, and with it came the promise of a future where breath would no longer be rare but abundant. The Silurian set the stage for the next act, the Devonian, the true age of fishes, and the dawn of the great forest that would take the atmosphere to new heights. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes, but perhaps it deserves another title too, the Age of Forests. For the first time in Earth's history, plants rose not just as patches of green but as towering structures reshaping the very chemistry of the air. Vast forests of tree-like plants such as Archaeopteris rooted themselves across continents. Their leaves spread wide, pulling in sunlight and carbon dioxide, while their deep roots locked organic matter into the soil. This process was more than just ecological. It was atmospheric engineering on a planetary scale. The forest was scrubbing the skies. Carbon dioxide levels dropped. Oxygen levels climbed higher than ever before. Insects thrived in this oxygen-rich air, and some grew to extraordinary sizes. Fossil evidence suggests dragonflies with wingspans over 2 feet, giants of the sky that relied on the surplus oxygen to fuel their massive flight muscles. Imagine sitting quietly in one of these Devonian groves, only to hear the thrum of giant wings as such a creature passed overhead. The oceans too reflected this transformation. Fish diversified into every imaginable form. Armoured placoderms prowled the reefs, while lobe-finned fishes experimented with fins sturdy enough to bear weight in shallow waters. It was here, in these oxygenated lagoons and swampy margins, that the first tentative steps onto land were taken by vertebrates. The link between air and life was becoming literal. For the first time, animals inhaled oxygen directly, rather than pulling it from water. But with growth came instability. The very forests that produced so much oxygen also drew down carbon dioxide so dramatically that they altered the climate. Cooling periods set in, and the oceans, always sensitive to shifts in chemistry, began to feel the stress. By the end of the Devonian, massive die-offs in reefs and shallow seas hinted that Earth's atmosphere, while a gift, could also be a knife's edge. Yet the legacy of the Devonian was undeniable. Oxygen had risen to levels that supported sprawling ecosystems both in water and on land. Life was diversifying as never before, and the atmosphere was finally beginning to resemble the breathable world we know. The later Devonian, though rich in forests and flourishing fishes, carried within it the seeds of collapse. Those same mighty trees that pulled carbon dioxide from the air left behind deep layers of organic matter. When roots broke apart, rock and rains washed the minerals into the seas, they fertilized algal blooms. For a time, these blooms pulsed with green across the oceans. But when the algae died, their decay consumed oxygen, leaving vast stretches of water starved of breath. Scientists call these conditions anoxic events, oceans turning silent, their oxygen gone. Picture a reef teeming with placoderms and corals one year, and then, only centuries later, the same reef nothing more than a rubble-strewn desert beneath dark water. Entire marine lineages fell in wave after wave of extinction. Coral families that had built underwater cities vanished forever. The armoured giants of the seas, Dunkleosteus among them, dwindled until their once dominant kind was reduced to bones in stone. On land, forests struggled too. As oxygen rose, fires became more common, sweeping through dry periods and scorching landscapes. The balance between plants and air was delicate, and Earth was still learning how to manage it. Small vertebrates had only just begun to breathe air, and yet they faced an atmosphere that shifted between gift and danger. It's here that you begin to see the paradox of the atmosphere. It is both sustainer and executioner. Too much oxygen can make fires rampant, too little, and seas suffocate. Life lived at the mercy of its own success. The Devonian ended with repeated ecological stumbles, a long twilight rather than a sudden cataclysm. But even in the losses, something new waited. Amphibians survived, insects endured. The forests, though scarred, continued to exhale, and so Earth entered its next act with a breath both deeper and more uncertain. Oxygen levels had risen far beyond the early poison skies. The air was becoming not only breathable but abundant, setting the stage for creatures larger, stranger, and more complex than the planet had ever known. Imagine walking into a forest where the air feels heavier than today, almost sweet with richness. Towering above you are trees unlike any modern oaks or pines. These are giant lycopsids, relatives of today's club mosses, but stretched to heights of 30 metres. Their trunks rise straight and narrow, their crowns like green fountains. Between them sprawl ferns and horsetails as tall as small buildings, their fronds arching in thick canopies. This is the Carboniferous world. Forests vast and endless, stretching across much of what is now North America and Europe, blanketing swamps and floodplains. The air you breathe in this imagined stroll is unlike anything your lungs evolved for. Oxygen makes up about 21% of today's atmosphere. In the Carboniferous, it soared to nearly 35%, the highest levels in Earth's history. Fires could spark with ease, fueled by dry lightning, and once started, they burned with frightening intensity. Yet this oxygen also allowed creatures to grow beyond the sizes we find familiar. Dragonflies, for example, became titans. Some had wingspans over 2 feet across, larger than a hawk. Imagine the slow, heavy beat of those wings above the swamp, the shadow passing over you like a living kite. Millipedes stretched as long as a car, centipedes stalked with venomous jaws, and scorpions the size of house cats patrolled the undergrowth. Insects, bound today by limits of oxygen delivery through tiny tubes, thrived in the abundance, free to grow to monstrous scale. But the Carboniferous wasn't just about insects. Amphibians ruled much of the land and water margins, their bodies swelling in diversity. Some were crocodile-like ambushers waiting in swamps. Others were small and lizard-like, scurrying among roots. These were early vertebrates, testing the edges of terrestrial life, breathing in the superoxygenated air and hunting in ecosystems dense with prey. The secret behind this atmospheric richness lay in the forests themselves. Plants were pumping out oxygen faster than Earth could absorb it. Thick, bark-like tissues, rich in carbon, resisted decay. Fallen trees didn't rot quickly. Instead, they piled up in the swamps, layer upon layer, burying carbon underground. Over millions of years, this process created the vast coal seams that humans would one day mine and burn, fueling our own industrial revolution. The atmosphere, meanwhile, bloomed with oxygen, as if Earth itself was experimenting with excess. Still, As lush and lively as this world was, it carried its own risks. Too much oxygen meant fires that raged uncontrollably. Lightning storms could ignite entire forests, and fossilized charcoal from the time reveals how frequent these blazes were. Life walked a delicate line, abundance in one breath, destruction in the next, and all the while, Earth's atmosphere was being primed for its next shift, one that would bring balance crashing back. As the Carboniferous period rolled toward its close, the balance of Earth's atmosphere began to tilt again. The same processes that had pumped oxygen to dizzying highs also set the stage for decline. The vast swampy forest that created so much oxygen began to shrink. Tectonic shifts raised mountains, drained wetlands, and altered coastlines. Where once stood endless green, drylands began to expand. With the forest dwindling, oxygen production slowed. At the same time, microbes evolved new ways to break down plant tissues that had once resisted decay. That shift meant more of the carbon that had been locked away was released again, and oxygen no longer surged unchecked. The atmosphere slipped downward, back toward levels closer to what we know today. The consequences rippled through life. Giant insects, once the undisputed masters of the air and undergrowth, lost their edge. Their oversized bodies had relied on oxygen-rich air to deliver enough fuel through their tiny breathing tubes. As oxygen fell, their physiology could no longer sustain such grandeur. Dragonflies shrank back to modest forms. Millipedes the size of cars dwindled into smaller, less monstrous crawlers. But the decline of insect giants was not the only shift. Amphibians, which had thrived in wet carboniferous swamps, faced harder times as aridity spread. In their place, early reptiles began to expand. With their tougher eggs and scaly skin, reptiles could survive away from water, breathing the thinner air and thriving where amphibians struggled. It was in this crucible that the ancestors of dinosaurs, mammals, and countless later creatures began their long rise. The atmosphere of the late Carboniferous and early Permian still held more oxygen than ours, but the days of fire-fueled abundance were over. Earth had reset its balance once more. Oxygen levels declined, ecosystems reorganized, and the story of life entered a new chapter. In a way, the Carboniferous stands as one of the most dramatic reminders of how closely life and atmosphere are entwined. Plants reshaped the very air, insects and amphibians swelled to impossible sizes, and fires swept forests with relentless force. And then, just as swiftly, shifts in climate and ecology drew the curtain closed on that oxygen-rich world. The Earth, as always, carried on, adjusting, recalibrating, preparing for what was to come. For ahead lay the Permian, an age of deserts, synapsids, and eventually one of the greatest atmospheric and ecological collapses the planet has ever endured. The Carboniferous forests faded, the swamps dried, and the atmosphere that had once burned with oxygen-rich abundance shifted toward a new balance. You find yourself walking forward in time into the Permian period, the final act of the Paleozoic era. The land has transformed. Instead of endless green, you now see wide deserts stretching across the heart of the supercontinent Pangaea. Mountains rise in jagged chains, rivers carve deep valleys, and the old swamp forests survive only in scattered patches along coasts and floodplains. The climate is harsher here. Hot summers, freezing winters, long droughts, sudden floods. The atmosphere reflects this change. Oxygen, once towering near 35%, has dropped closer to 20-25%, not far from the levels you breathe today. Still higher than modern air, but no longer a supercharged fuel. This drop reshapes life. The giant insects of the Carboniferous lose their dominance. They shrink, and their once grand reign of dragonfly emperors and millipede titans ends. But other creatures thrive in this new world. Reptiles, stronger lungs, tougher eggs, scales that lock in moisture, step into the spotlight. They breathe more efficiently, and in the slightly thinner oxygen they hold the advantage. Some grow large and fierce, gorgonopsids, saber-toothed hunters with long skulls and curved fangs, pariasaurs, massive herbivores armoured in bony plates, and the early synapsids, distant ancestors of mammals. The atmosphere of the Permian was not static. While oxygen declined, carbon dioxide shifted as well. During the early and middle Permian, CO2 levels were relatively low, encouraging cooler climates in some regions. But toward the end of the period, something stirred deep in the earth. Beneath Siberia, Enormous plumes of magma rose, preparing for one of the greatest volcanic events in history, the Siberian Traps eruptions. Before those eruptions began, the Permian was already a land of extremes. Dry air carried dust across continents, inland seas evaporated into salt flats. Some regions saw frost, others blistering heat. Oxygen levels continued their gradual decline, never plunging to suffocating lows, yet falling enough that ecosystems felt the strain. Animals adapted by evolving new breathing systems, new metabolisms, new ways to survive. It is worth pausing on the quiet resilience of life here. While the Carboniferous had been an age of lush excess, the Permian was an age of hardiness. The creatures that thrived were not the delicate giants of oxygen-rich swamps, but the survivors of arid plains and fluctuating skies. Evolution was training the biosphere for endurance, a rehearsal for the trials to come. But endurance has limits. By the late Permian, oxygen slipped further, possibly dipping below 15% in some estimates. Fires burned less often, but so too did lungs struggle in higher altitudes and harsher climates. Even before catastrophe struck, Earth was already pushing its ecosystems toward fragility. And then the volcanoes opened. The land shudders. From deep fractures in what is now Siberia, rivers of molten basalt erupt, not for days, not for centuries, but for hundreds of thousands of years. These were not ordinary volcanic eruptions, but flood basalts, among the most colossal outpourings of lava in Earth's history. Layer upon layer of molten rock spreads across millions of square kilometers, eventually piling kilometers thick. But the lava itself was not the only killer. Each eruption belched carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide into the skies. The atmosphere grew turbulent. At first, the sulfur aerosols cooled the planet, dimming sunlight, triggering bitter chills. Then, as greenhouse gases accumulated, the pendulum swung the other way, toward unbearable heat. Imagine the atmosphere then. Hazy, acrid, poisoned. Oxygen already weakened, now suffocated further as oceans and soils shifted. Vast anoxic zones spread across seas, the waters turning stagnant and lifeless. Methane released from destabilized clathrates in the seafloor may have turbocharged the warming, adding fire to fire. Rain turned acidic, scarring forests. CO2 drove the climate into a fever, raising global temperatures by as much as 8 to 10 degrees. On land, ecosystems unraveled. In the oceans, reefs collapsed entirely. Coral builders, already stressed, vanished. Trilobites, those survivors of centuries, disappeared forever. Insects, once resilient, endured their first great collapse. The very breath of the planet faltered. This was the Permian Triassic extinction, known simply as the Great Dying. Roughly 90–95% of marine species and 70% of land species vanished. The atmosphere had tipped into lethal instability. Too little oxygen, too much heat, too many toxins. The air itself became an agent of extinction. Pause here and reflect. 5 times in Earth's history, the atmosphere has shifted so sharply that life could not keep pace. The Permian was the worst of them all. The closest Earth has come to losing nearly everything. And yet, even here, even in the poisoned skies and stagnant seas, some life endured. Small reptiles, burrowing synapsids, a handful of plants clinging to fragile soils. In the oceans, a few bivalves, ammonites and fishes survived. They carried the memory of air forward. Their descendants would breathe again under new skies, in a new world, the Triassic. The atmosphere had stumbled, staggered, nearly failed, but not entirely. Earth inhaled again, and life found a way forward. The Earth is quiet now, perhaps quieter than it has ever been. The Great Dying has passed, leaving deserts of stone where once forests swayed, and oceans strangely barren where once reefs glittered with life. The atmosphere, though still heavy with carbon dioxide, has begun to ease its fever. Volcanic fury has subsided. The skies, though pale and strange, carry within them the first whispers of recovery. This is the dawn of the Triassic period, about 250 million years ago. Life teeters, fragile and thin but not absent. A handful of survivors step forward to repopulate a wounded world. The air is still hot, the oxygen lower than in later ages, and the seasons unpredictable. Yet for the first time in millions of years, the balance no longer tips toward collapse. Slowly the planet begins to heal. On land, small reptiles scurry through sparse vegetation. Among them are synapsids, distant ancestors of mammals, their bodies adapted to burrow and conserve energy. Some of these creatures, no larger than modern house cats, will eventually give rise to the lineage that leads to us. For now, they cling to survival in the shade of cycads and ginkgos. Above, the air carries fewer insects than in the Carboniferous or Permian, but they return in fits and starts, beetles, dragonflies, and primitive flies testing the skies again. Their buzzing is faint compared to earlier symphonies, but it is a sound of resilience. The atmosphere plays a decisive role here. Though still recovering from excess carbon dioxide, the steadying climate allows plants to spread again. Where once acid rain scoured the soil, new growth pushes through. Ferns reclaim ground. Conifers stretch upward, their evergreen needles catching the sun. With each new leaf, oxygen levels begin to climb, drop by drop, breath by breath. And with this rebounding air comes opportunity. Reptiles diversify, testing shapes and strategies. Some become armoured, others grow long necks, some shrink small and agile. Out of these experiments, a particular group begins to rise, the first true dinosaurs. They are not yet the giants of the Jurassic, but small two-legged hunters and nimble herbivores, living lightly on a recovering Earth. The skies that almost ended life now cradle the future rulers of the Mesozoic. Still, recovery is never smooth. Periodic warming pulses disrupt ecosystems, and extinction shadows linger. But the great difference now is that life has space to expand. The atmosphere no longer poisons everything it touches. Instead, it slowly becomes an ally again, shaping the rebirth of forests, seas, and skies. Pause and imagine. Walking across this Triassic world, the air dry and thin, the land dotted with hardy greenery, the silence broken by the sudden cry of a reptile in the distance. You would feel both the fragility and the promise in every breath. For the Earth has stepped back from the edge, and the story of life is ready to continue. Beneath the surface of the Triassic seas, life returns in cautious steps. The oceans had been stripped nearly bare during the Great Dying, their chemistry warped by heat, acid, and suffocation. Now, as the skies calm and the balance of gases shifts, the waters begin to heal. Phytoplankton reappear in the sunlit shallows, their microscopic bodies weaving oxygen and food back into the marine web. With them come tiny invertebrates followed by larger grazers and hunters. It is a slow layering of life, but once again the seas shimmer with possibility. The ocean, long starved of breath, is relearning how to inhale. The first great marine reptiles emerge here, claiming niches left vacant by extinction. Ichthyosaurs, sleek and dolphin-shaped, dart through the waters. Their lungs still depend on air, but they are perfectly adapted to hunt beneath the waves. Alongside them glide nothosaurs, long-necked hunters of shallow lagoons. These new forms represent a bold experiment, reptiles returning to the sea, finding new freedom in the blue expanse. The atmosphere plays its part. Rising oxygen levels trickle into the water, stabilizing ecosystems and allowing larger creatures to thrive. Though not yet as oxygen-rich as future ages, the Triassic seas are far safer than the suffocating basins of the Permian. Each breath a reptile takes above the surface reflects a world slowly stitching itself back together. Coral reefs, however, remain absent. The great reef builders of earlier ages are gone, and it will take millions of years before new corals reclaim their role. In their place, sponges and algae form modest underwater structures, providing homes for fish and mollusks. The seas are less ornate than before, but they are alive again, and that is enough. Predators return too. Primitive sharks cruise the currents, ammonites spiral through the water, and fish diversify into swift schools. With every passing million years, the marine world becomes more vibrant. The great cycles of carbon and oxygen, once shattered, resume their rhythm. The atmosphere stabilizes, the seas breathe, and life multiplies. This fragile rebirth will set the stage for the explosive abundance of the Jurassic. But for now, in the Triassic, it is enough that the oceans live again. They are not yet lush, not yet overflowing, but they are survivors, like the creatures they hold. Imagine floating above these waters at dusk. The air is warmer than you're used to, drier, tinged with ancient scents of pine and fern. Beneath you, an ichthyosaur surfaces to exhale, misting the sky with a plume of breath before diving back into the depths. It is a reminder that even after the worst silence, life finds its way back into the song of the earth. The Jurassic begins like a deep breath after a long silence. The atmosphere, richer now in oxygen than in the Permian or Triassic, fills the skies with possibility. It is not the highest oxygen Earth will ever know, but it is enough to awaken forests, thicken canopies, and fuel the rise of animals that push against the boundaries of size and flight. Imagine yourself walking into one of these Jurassic forests. Towering conifers dominate, their trunks stretching skyward, their needles whispering in the wind. Beneath them spread cycads and ferns, leaves broad and green, a lush understory teeming with insects. The air is warm and humid, carrying the sharp scent of resin and damp soil. You breathe deeply and feel the oxygen steady, plentiful, sustaining. Above the canopy, something new glides through the air. The first great pterosaurs spread their membranous wings, catching thermal currents and soaring across landscapes. They are the first vertebrates to master flight, and the atmosphere makes it possible. With higher oxygen content, muscles find more endurance, wings carry them further, and the skies are transformed from emptiness into avenues of exploration. On the ground, dinosaurs diversify and expand into nearly every available niche. Some grow massive, like the long-necked sauropods, towering over forests and exhaling plumes of vapour into the warm air. Others remain small, nimble hunters darting between shadows. Each breath they take reflects the steady partnership between atmosphere and life. Oxygen fuels motion, carbon dioxide feeds plants, and the cycle turns without pause. The seas too are reshaped. The oceans now carry more stable oxygen levels than during the early Triassic recovery. Ichthyosaurs reach their peak diversity, plesiosaurs appear with their strange necks and sleek bodies, and fish schools dart in synchronized silver ribbons. The air above these waters connects to the depth below, every exhale of a marine reptile echoing the strength of the Jurassic sky. The quirky thing about this period is the dragonflies. They are no longer the giants of the Carboniferous, when oxygen was nearly double today's levels, but they still hover gracefully above ferns and streams, buzzing wings tracing arcs of light. Their presence is a living memory of earlier atmospheric extremes, a reminder of how air itself shapes size and possibility. And in the background, birds begin their earliest chapters. Small feathered dinosaurs experiment with flight. Their feathers first meant for insulation or display, now repurposed into wings. The thin air currents carry them awkwardly at first, but with every generation the skies become more crowded with new flyers. The atmosphere is not only fuel but also invitation. Yet scientists still wonder, how much did oxygen levels really dictate the size of Jurassic giants? Sauropods reached immense proportions, far larger than most land animals today. Was it purely food and environment, or did the balance of gases give them hidden advantages? Lungs more efficient, breaths more sustaining? The answers remain debated, but the air of the Jurassic certainly carried the weight of their greatness. The Earth at this point feels alive, confident, expansive. The scars of extinction are fading, replaced by forests, herds, wings, and calls echoing through valleys. The atmosphere has become not just survivable, but generous. It is a partner in abundance, a backdrop for some of the most iconic life to ever walk, swim, or soar across the planet. The skies of the Jurassic were not just open, they were dynamic, shaped by the breathing of the Earth itself. Volcanic activity remained frequent across the planet, sending carbon dioxide into the air and warming the global climate. That warmth, paired with rising sea levels, created shallow seas along continents where reefs flourished. These reefs, in turn, exhaled oxygen as algae and microbes worked tirelessly, helping balance the very air that animals breathed. It is easy to picture the cycles as invisible threads connecting all life. A sauropod munches through a grove of conifers, stripping branches with its peg-like teeth. Its massive lungs draw in gulps of oxygen, powering muscles that move its long tail in sweeping arcs. Each exhale releases carbon dioxide that feeds the forest again, closing the loop. Multiply this by millions of creatures, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, insects, fish, and the atmosphere becomes not a background, but a pulse beating in rhythm with life. One quirky note from this time lies in the chemistry of soil. Jurassic soils often contain signs of intense microbial activity, with bacteria locking away carbon and fixing nitrogen in ways that made forests even more productive. These tiny, unseen workers shaped the air just as surely as the towering dinosaurs did. You might overlook them, but their quiet presence was the foundation of oxygen stability. Still, oxygen levels in the Jurassic never soared to the extremes of the Carboniferous. Scientists suggest they hovered around 25%, slightly higher than today, enough to support large bodies and active metabolisms, but not enough to resurrect insect giants of old. This balance was key. Too little oxygen, and great reptiles would struggle. Too much, and wildfires would sweep forests uncontrollably, as they did in earlier eras. That delicate balance raises questions. Could it be that life itself learned to regulate the air by this point? Plants exhaling oxygen, animals breathing it in, microbes locking carbon away. Together, a homeostatic system emerges. Earth, in its deep patience, may have discovered resilience not by chance, but by feedbacks woven into the very fabric of the biosphere. From this stability, diversity flourished. Crocodile-like reptiles lurked in rivers, dragonflies skimmed their surfaces, and primitive birds took hesitant flights between branches. In the seas, ammonites spiraled outward in perfect shells, their siphons pulsing with each breath of oceanic oxygen. Above it all, pterosaurs soared on wings that stretched wider than small planes, carried effortlessly by currents of warm Jurassic air. When you imagine this world, it is easy to forget silence. The air must have been alive with sound, the heavy footsteps of sauropods, the trumpeting calls of herds, the screeches of predators, the wing beats of early birds, the rustling of trees. Each sound carried on molecules of air that had once been volcanic gases, transformed by forests, reefs and microbes into the breathable mix that made all of it possible. The Jurassic atmosphere was a steady partner in this crescendo of life. It did not gift the world with extremes, but with balance, and in that balance the Age of Giants reached its full stride. By the dawn of the Cretaceous, around 145 million years ago, the Earth was a world in transformation. Continents drifted into new positions, seas rose and spread across lowlands, and forests unfurled across fresh landscapes. The air above this shifting planet carried the chemistry of change too. Oxygen levels, though not as high as the Carboniferous peak, were still elevated, hovering around 25% or a little more. This mix allowed life to reach new heights, quite literally, as both birds and flowering plants began to flourish. Imagine walking into a Cretaceous forest. The air feels heavy with humidity, laden with the scent of pine-like trees and the first delicate flowers. Pollinators, bees and beetles, hum through shafts of sunlight, carrying grains of pollen that shimmer like golden dust. Every breath you take is rich, filling your lungs more deeply than modern air might, and you would need it. Around you, dinosaurs dominate in size and number. Towering hadrosaurs, horned ceratopsians, and predators like raptors moving with quick precision. Each heartbeat of these creatures is powered by that oxygen-rich atmosphere. One quirky fact from this time, Cretaceous plants were experimenting. Angiosperms, the flowering plants, were spreading widely for the first time in Earth's history. Unlike conifers or cycads, these plants co-evolved with insects, exchanging nectar for pollination. This partnership not only changed ecosystems, it changed the air. Flowers pulled carbon dioxide, produced oxygen, and set into motion a cascade of ecological interactions that still define the modern biosphere. The oceans mirrored this transformation. Rising seas created shallow marine shelves teeming with life. Plankton bloomed in staggering numbers, their tiny shells sinking into sediments that, over millions of years, would form the chalk cliffs of places like Dover. Each microscopic shell represented carbon locked away, a process that helped stabilize Earth's atmosphere, even as volcanoes continued to pump gases skyward. But with all this abundance came risk. The Cretaceous climate was warmer than today, and fluctuations in ocean circulation sometimes triggered low oxygen zones in the seas, dead zones, where life suffocated. Fossil layers tell us of these intervals, where black shales rich in organic material record moments when oxygen collapsed beneath the waves. It is a sobering reminder that even during ages of richness, fragility lingered. The air itself, though breathable and generous, was still shaped by forces beyond life's control. Massive volcanic outpourings, especially toward the end of the Cretaceous, altered its balance with bursts of carbon dioxide. The atmosphere became a theatre of both creation and tension, sustaining vast ecosystems while hinting at the vulnerability that would soon lead to one of history's greatest endings. As the Cretaceous marched toward its close, the atmosphere seemed to hold both promise and doom. Oxygen was still higher than today, around 25%, but the air carried signals of imbalance, gigantic volcanic events, such as those that built the Deccan Traps in what is now India, belched carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the skies. These gases did two contradictory things. They trapped heat, raising global temperatures, while also casting sulfuric aerosols that could dim the sunlight for months or years at a time. Imagine breathing this air. It is still life-giving, but tinged with the acrid hint of volcanic haze. The ecosystems above and below depended on that fragile balance. Dinosaurs, whether the immense sauropods that thundered across plains or the swift theropods that stalked prey, needed every breath of oxygen to sustain their massive bodies. Birds, already diversifying into forms we would recognize, took advantage of lighter bones and efficient lungs, a gift of both anatomy and atmosphere. Even mammals, still small but quietly evolving in the shadows, shared this same air, preparing for a world they did not yet know would soon be theirs. One quirky curiosity of this period is the link between atmosphere and size. Many paleontologists think that higher oxygen and warmer conditions allowed insects and some reptiles to grow larger than their modern relatives. Though they were never as gigantic as carboniferous dragonflies, the Cretaceous still hosted outsized beetles, wasps, and other air-breathing arthropods thriving in oxygen-rich environments. And then came the moment that would reshape everything. Around 66 million years ago, a 10-kilometre-wide asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula, vaporizing rock and sending dust and aerosols billowing into the atmosphere. The chemistry of the air changed in an instant. Fires raged, soot darkened the skies, and sulfur released from vaporized rock triggered acid rains. The once oxygen-rich skies dimmed beneath a veil of debris. Photosynthesis faltered. Food chains collapsed. For months, perhaps years, the atmosphere carried the scent of ash and the bite of acid. Dinosaurs, the great rulers of the Cretaceous, found themselves starved of light, warmth, and food. Yet even amid this devastation, the survivors endured. Birds persisted in scattered refuges. Small mammals endured underground or in sheltered niches. Crocodiles, turtles, and fish waited patiently in rivers and seas. These creatures breathed through the chaos, proving once again that survival is often less about strength than about resilience and adaptability. When the dust eventually cleared, the Earth's atmosphere began to reset. Carbon dioxide slowly diminished as life recovered, and oxygen levels adjusted to new balances. The stage was set for the rise of mammals, and eventually for you. The Cretaceous atmosphere had been both a cradle and a crucible, and in its final act it handed over the future to new voices in the symphony of life. The asteroid had done its work, and the age of dinosaurs was gone. What followed was the Paleogene period, the beginning of a new world, a time when mammals began to step into the ecological space left behind, and when the Earth's atmosphere became both a challenge and an opportunity for survival. In those first million years after the impact, the skies were not yet welcoming. Ash and soot lingered, carbon dioxide levels had spiked, and sunlight was weaker than before. Temperatures swung between extremes, with impact winters of chilling darkness giving way to waves of heat as greenhouse gases trapped more energy. For creatures breathing that air, life was fragile and uncertain. Yet paradoxically, this unstable atmosphere cleared a path for mammals and birds. The oxygen levels during the Paleogene were lower than in the Cretaceous, hovering closer to modern ranges, about 21%. This made life harder for any species that relied on sheer size and high oxygen intake. Gigantic reptiles were no longer sustainable. Instead, smaller, more adaptable animals had the advantage. Mammals that had once hidden in burrows or lived nocturnal lives now thrived under the shifting skies. With less oxygen in the air, they evolved efficient lungs, higher metabolic rates, and new survival strategies that allowed them to spread rapidly across the continents. One quirky footnote of the early Paleogene is that some mammals ballooned in size surprisingly quickly. Within 10 million years of the extinction, you had creatures like Andrewsarchus, a wolf-like giant, and Paraceratherium, one of the largest land mammals ever to live, rivaling dinosaurs in bulk. How did they manage it in an atmosphere with less oxygen? Scientists suggest that warmer climates and lush vegetation played a role, offering abundant food even if every breath carried slightly less life than before. The atmosphere also carried the first hints of modern climate cycles. Volcanic activity and tectonic shifts pumped carbon dioxide into the air, driving warming trends. But the Earth was also beginning to establish the feedback loops that stabilize climate over long timescales. Plants drawing in carbon, oceans absorbing gases, and weathering rocks locking carbon into stone. These processes weren't yet perfect, but they pointed toward the more balanced atmosphere that humans would one day inherit. And then, about 55 million years ago, the atmosphere itself seemed to have a fever. This event, known as the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum (PETM), saw a sudden and massive release of carbon, likely from volcanic eruptions or methane hydrates in the ocean. Temperatures soared, forests spread even into polar regions, and the skies grew thick with greenhouse gases. The air was warm, heavy, and laden with humidity. Mammals adapted by shrinking. Smaller bodies lose heat more easily. So many lineages of early horses, primates, and other animals actually decreased in size during this time. It's one of those atmospheric quirks that challenges the imagination. A global heat wave lasting 200,000 years, reshaping evolution simply by changing the chemistry of the air. For mammals, it was a trial by fire, but also a chance to prove their resilience. By the time the Earth cooled again, many of the ancestors of modern species had appeared, their lungs and bodies shaped by this dance between oxygen, carbon, and heat. As the Paleocene gave way to the Eocene, the atmosphere began to calm from its fever. The massive heat wave of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum eventually eased, and though the air remained warmer than today, it carried within it the first steady rhythms of a world where mammals would thrive. Forests now covered nearly every continent, stretching even into what we would consider polar regions. The atmosphere, still rich in carbon dioxide compared to modern levels, acted like a global greenhouse. Yet oxygen remained close to modern proportions, which meant breathing became more stable. Animals could depend on a consistent air chemistry that encouraged experimentation in body forms, diets, and lifestyles. It was in this breathable, humid, and lush air that primates took their first confident steps. Tiny lemur-like creatures leapt through tropical canopies, their large eyes adapting to both daylight and twilight, their lungs drinking in the same balance of gases that still sustains you today. Without this atmospheric stabilization, the evolutionary pathway that led to humans might never have unfolded. One fascinating tidbit is that atmospheric changes didn't just shape bodies, they shaped behaviors. Higher carbon dioxide levels, for example, supported denser forests, and in those tangled ecosystems, animals had to evolve agility, cleverness, and social behaviors to survive. The primates who navigated those forests weren't just breathing air, they were breathing opportunity. Scientists still debate the exact triggers of the PETM carbon release, and whether a sudden methane burst from the oceans played a role. What's clear is that the atmosphere itself became a sculptor of evolution, rewarding the small, the quick, and the adaptable. Every lungful of air carried both challenge and promise, weaving mammals, birds, and eventually primates into a new chapter of Earth's story. And so, by the end of the Eocene, the Earth's skies had transformed from the choking aftermath of the asteroid strike into a breathable cradle for life's future. The stage was set for further experiments, and for the eventual rise of beings who would look up at the sky and wonder how it all began. The story of Earth's atmosphere now moves into a time closer to your own, an era when ice carved valleys, winds carried dust across continents, and the chemistry of the sky became a direct test for the survival of humans and their ancestors. This was the Pleistocene epoch, stretching from about 2.6 million years ago until just 12,000 years ago. It was an epoch defined by cycles, long cold ice ages followed by warmer interglacial periods. Massive sheets of ice advanced and retreated across the northern hemisphere, their weight sculpting mountains, flattening plains, and redirecting rivers. Each time the ice grew, sea levels dropped, exposing land bridges that allowed animals, and eventually humans, to migrate across the globe. But what made these great cycles possible was the delicate interplay of Earth's orbit, sunlight, and atmosphere. Even small shifts in greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane helped tip the balance between ice and warmth. During glacial peaks, carbon dioxide levels dipped as low as 180 parts per million, far lower than today's 420 ppm. The thinness of greenhouse gases meant that winters deepened, summers cooled, and ice advanced. Then, when volcanic activity or ocean circulation released stored carbon back into the air, warming began again, and the glaciers melted away. For humans, this unstable atmosphere was both a challenge and an opportunity. The ancestors of modern humans, Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens, emerged and spread during these shifting climates. The thin, crisp air of the glacial steppes forced resilience. Fire became not only a source of warmth, but also a way to shape food and light. Breath itself carried a new significance. In glacial valleys, you inhaled cold, dry air that demanded stronger lungs, while in warmer refuges the air was heavier, filled with moisture and life. One quirky detail often overlooked is that the fluctuating oxygen and carbon dioxide levels likely influenced not just survival, but creativity. In times of greater oxygen abundance, closer to interglacials, energy for endurance increased. This may have supported long-distance hunting and migrations, while harsher low oxygen, low-carbon conditions tested endurance, demanding adaptation in body size and brain metabolism. And here lies a debate scientists still grapple with. Did the pressures of shifting air and climate sharpen human intelligence? Was it the ice and the fluctuating breath of the earth that made us problem solvers, storytellers, fire makers, and tool builders? As glaciers advanced and withdrew, the air above them carried silence and clarity, a thin veil reminding every living creature of the fragility of balance. And through this balance, humans learned to master not just survival, but the beginnings of civilization. As the last great ice age loosened its grip, the atmosphere of Earth shifted once more, this time towards stability. Around 12,000 years ago, the Holocene epoch began, marking the end of the Pleistocene's constant swings between glacial and interglacial extremes. For the first time in millions of years, the air settled into a relatively steady rhythm, warm enough for forests to spread widely and stable enough for human societies to take root. The chemistry of the atmosphere reflected this new calm. Carbon dioxide rose back toward 280 ppm, not high enough to trap overwhelming heat, but sufficient to keep the planet's climate within a narrow band of stability. Oxygen, too, hovered close to its modern levels, around 21%, enough to fuel the fires of human invention, but not so high as to risk the uncontrollable blazes of ancient ages. For the first time, the sky became a dependable partner in human destiny. This balance allowed something remarkable: the rise of agriculture. With stable seasons, humans could plant seeds and predict harvests. The breath of the earth, its winds, rains, and steady climate, gave them a stage on which villages, then cities, then civilizations could grow. From the Fertile Crescent to the valleys of the Indus and the Nile, air and soil together became the foundation of culture. One quirky but fascinating detail is how the atmosphere began to change in response to humans themselves. By about 5,000 years ago, as rice paddies spread across Asia and cattle herds grew in number, levels of methane in the air began to rise. Some scientists argue that this early agricultural activity nudged the atmosphere just enough to prevent the onset of another ice age. If true, it means humanity has been shaping the breath of the planet far longer than the industrial era. And here lies an open question still debated today. Is the Holocene stable because of pure natural cycles, or because humans inadvertently became the first geoengineers? Did ploughed fields and managed herds save us from another long descent into ice? For now, what matters is that this era gave humans a sky that was not threatening, but sustaining. You can almost imagine the feeling, to step outside and breathe air that was neither too thin nor too toxic, to look up at clouds drifting across a sky that had become familiar, safe, dependable. For the first time in Earth's history, the atmosphere wasn't simply a background for survival. It was the medium through which culture, language, and memory could endure. And so, the Holocene became the cradle of history. The breath of Earth was steady, and in that steadiness humans found the chance to dream. The Holocene's steady breath has carried humanity for 10,000 years. Yet, as we move into the present, a new chapter unfolds, one many scientists now call the Anthropocene. Unlike the ancient upheavals of volcanoes, asteroids, or tectonic shifts, this era is defined by us. For the first time in Earth's 4.5 billion years, a single species is altering the very chemistry of the sky on a global scale. You can picture it. The thin veil of atmosphere above, only a few dozen kilometers thick, cradling every breath of life. Into this fragile skin, humanity has poured the exhaust of factories, engines, and fires. Carbon dioxide, once stable at 280 ppm for thousands of years, has surged past 420 ppm in only 2 centuries, a blink in geological time. The air itself is changing faster than at almost any moment in Earth's history. One mainstream fact strikes hard. The last time Earth saw this much carbon dioxide, sea levels were tens of meters higher, and crocodiles swam in the Arctic. Today, that ancient climate is returning, but far faster than natural cycles would allow. A quirky twist is that the very gases humans now pump into the sky were laid down by the earliest forests and plankton hundreds of millions of years ago. Coal, oil, and natural gas are the fossilized breath of ancient worlds, exhaled once more into the air after eons of burial. In a strange way, when you breathe in modern city air, you're inhaling whispers of Devonian swamps and Mesozoic seas. And yet, the open question remains: will humanity's transformation of the atmosphere trigger a 6th great extinction, or will it mark the moment we learn to consciously shape the climate for survival? Can we bend the sky back toward balance, or will we let it slip beyond our control? The Anthropocene is both a warning and a mirror. The breath of the Earth has always shifted, but never before under the deliberate hand of its own inhabitants. Now, as you exhale, you are not just a passenger in this story. You are part of the force writing the next chapter. The story of Earth's atmosphere begins in poison and silence and arrives now, in this delicate human-shaped moment. Through every era, the air has shifted. Hydrogen and methane seas giving way to oxygen skies, carbon dioxide cycles rising and falling with ice and fire, volcanic breath and asteroid dust rewriting climates, forests pulling down gases and oceans exhaling them back. Each transformation was both an ending and a beginning. Now, as you lie in stillness, you can sense how thin the air above truly is. From the ground to the stratosphere, the atmosphere is no more than a fragile skin stretched around the planet, a skin that has carried the breath of trilobites, dinosaurs, mammoths, and now you. It is humbling to realize that every inhale you take connects you not just to the present moment, but to the entire history of life itself. Mainstream science tells us that without this invisible envelope, Earth would swing between extremes, daytime deserts scorched by solar fire, nights frozen into lifeless silence. It is the atmosphere that makes the world habitable, that softens the rawness of space into something we can call home. But here is a quirky truth. The air you breathe right now is not fresh. Each molecule has been recycled countless times through volcano plumes, ocean waves, animal lungs, and plant leaves. The oxygen in your blood may once have passed through the gills of a Devonian fish, the spiracles of an ancient dragonfly, or the leaves of a carboniferous fern. You're literally stitched into the memory of deep time, and still, the open question lingers. What story will the air tell of us? Will the Anthropocene be remembered as a chapter of collapse, where humanity tipped the balance too far? Or will it become the moment of awareness, the turning where we finally realize the sky is not infinite, not immune, but alive and fragile and shared? The air whispers a quiet lesson. Survival is never guaranteed, but resilience is always possible. Just as oxygen once turned catastrophe into opportunity, just as life returned after fire and ice, so too can the present be reshaped by care. So breathe deeply now. Feel how your breath joins the endless cycle, part of the same rhythm that carried cyanobacteria across shallow seas, forests across continents, and birds across the skies. The atmosphere is not just air, it is memory, it is connection, it is life's most enduring companion. And as you drift toward rest, let this thought cradle you. The earth endures, the sky remembers, and with every breath you're both witness and participant in a story 4 billion years in the making. The story slows now, softening into silence. Imagine the air around you as a gentle blanket, layered with the whispers of all who came before. In the darkness of night, the sky above is steady, vast yet delicate. The stars shine through it, unbothered, while the thin blue breath of earth holds you close. The air has carried storms, fires, and ash, yet it has always quieted. It has borne extinction and rebirth, silence and song. Tonight it carries only you, your breathing, slow and calm, blending with the rhythm of the planet itself. The sixth extinction, the Anthropocene, the debates of science and survival, they all fade into something softer now. What remains is simple. Inhale, exhale. The same air that once filled ancient seas now fills your lungs. The same molecules that danced in the Permian sun now steady your heartbeat. The atmosphere is history, but it is also this moment. Let the weight of time fall away. You do not need to carry it. The sky has carried it for billions of years, and it will continue long after your dreams have begun. Trust in that resilience, in that patience. Trust in the breath that will still be here tomorrow, waiting for you, as it always has. So rest now. The Earth is turning gently. The atmosphere is holding steady. The story of the sky continues, but for tonight, it can pause. Thank you for spending this evening with Moontide Stories. Sleep well, rest deeply, and may tomorrow greet you with peace. Good night.